Thank you very much, Diana. Sorry, Genevieve from GSK. Okay, next is Diana Lanchoney speaking for Merck and Company.
Thank you. Can you hear me well on the phone?
Yes. I may ask you, though, to speak a little more slowly than you would normally.
I will.
Thank you.
On behalf of Merck, thank you for the chance to provide comment on the Smart Vaccine Prioritization Tool. I will try to condense my remarks, especially given the difficulties of speaking on the phone. But overall, the committee's work is a useful step towards achieving the goal of developing a catalog of prioritized vaccine targets as articulated in the National Vaccine Plan. Through my comments, I'll focus on 4 specific suggestions for the committee to consider, focused on utility, application development, and outreach. And to provide those comments, I'd suggest we start with the end in mind. And what I'll spend a minute doing is envisioning perhaps how the tool could optimally be used to guide the efforts of the vaccine development enterprise. If we imagine there was a common framework and language to assess the desirability and feasibility of a new vaccine from multiple perspectives, we could imagine that common framework and language was consistently applied across stakeholder groups, including researching groups, producing groups, buying groups, and supporting policy and regulatory groups. That framework might also be durably applied across the typical 10 years or more of a vaccine development program. And through that dialogue, we might imagine that the stakeholder inputs would gradually yield an actionable number of prioritized vaccine targets of high value to specific major stakeholders. And with those priorities being clear, other groups could meaningfully guide their investments toward new vaccine targets of the greatest interest to their key audiences. And really, this is just as true of manufacturers who should rationally be trying to address targets of highest value to public health and policy leaders of various geographies, as it is to the scientific and regulatory enterprise who should be investing to reduce data gaps, technology gaps, unfeasible regulatory barriers, or other impediments to making highly desired new vaccines more feasible to develop. And finally, if we imagine this process of prioritization extended through to the time of vaccine introduction, with a public health enterprise positioned to implement new vaccines in such a way so as to maximally achieve the long sought after benefits, we would have quite an accomplishment for society to be proud of. So considering that idealized vision, the utility of the tool is potentially quite high. Today, there is no common framework that efficiently and consistently frames discussion across multiple perspectives, and the SMART tool may set a foundation for that type of dialogue. The tool would have its best chance of realizing that vision with 4 specific improvements. First, we'd suggest that the methods should be developed to allow for multiple strategic objectives to coexist for each given stakeholder with their own supportive target rankings. In a manufacturer setting, for example, we may have some projects that fare highly around a primary objective to demonstrate scientific innovation. And for other cases, the primary goal may be to build on an existing business within a segment, adolescents or adults, for example, or to address unmet needs in certain regions of the world. In this way, the tool can build transparency into the often multiple coexisting strategic goals held by stakeholders. And were the methods to allow for multiple rank lists around each objective to be present, it would allow for other stakeholders in the vaccine development enterprise to target their activities towards goals where they have the greatest overlap in strategic interests. Second, the scoring methods should ideally be adjusted to allow not just rank order, but more linear values which could be compared across targets ranked by a given stakeholder. Only with this sort of information would resource allocation be proportionately directed to the opportunities of differentiably higher value, rather than just to some of similarly valued vaccines near the top of a ranked list. Third, consistency and durability of use of the tool over time and across audiences is absolutely necessary to achieve this vision. To achieve that consistency and durable use, a central organizing function coordinating a sustained process of dialogue using the tool as its center will be needed. The scope of that process should have two critical action planning elements. First, gaps or barriers impacting the highest vaccine priorities for various groups, especially buying groups such as government health authorities, must be identified and solved for in collaboration with other actors in the vaccine ecosystem. These gaps could be in the availability of adequate data to fully inform a target assessment, or in the development of a feasible regulatory pathway for highly desired vaccines. The process must serve to highlight such key barriers and develop specific actions to address them. Second, the scope of the process should extend to facilitation and support of new vaccines through the implementation phase. After all, how useful would the tool be to set priorities if, after all the toil, the same priorities don't influence the support which a vaccine gets at the time of implementation? Fourth, and most important, a clear and coherent set of messages must ultimately be issued by buying institutions, such as governments, regarding conditions or assumptions under which they remain willing to fully support a desired vaccine's introduction. It's critical that if a vaccine is delivered to meet these assumptions, that the vaccine receives the requisite support from the public health community. It's also critical that if those conditions or assumptions change, that these changes are clearly and promptly articulated to other stakeholder groups, including manufacturers. This clarity of communications regarding conditional willingness to fully support a new vaccine is essential in order to optimally direct increasingly scarce R&D dollars to the vaccine targets of highest priority. I'll close in simply briefly reviewing those 4 improvements for the committee to consider going forward in their important work. First, the tool's methods should be modified to allow sub-portfolios to be formed and ranked in support of varied institutional strategic objectives, rather than allow only one master list. Second, weighting and ranking methods should be modified to inform not just numeric rank, but actual linear comparison of scores by a given stakeholder. Third, the tool should be stewarded by a central owner, which would be intimately involved in a sustained, transparent, and inclusive process on new vaccine priorities. This process should extend through to action planning to improve feasibility of high priority targets and to fully support prioritized vaccine introduction. And finally, the U.S. public health leadership and other buying groups should lead in this effort by communicating specific priorities and underlying assumptions that will drive their full support of desired new vaccine introduction. Thank you again to the committee for its work and the opportunity to provide input to the project.
Thank you. On to Seth Hetherington of Genocea Biosciences.
Thanks very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to address the committee and visitors here. The usual disclaimer, the opinions are my own, don't necessarily reflect my company nor anybody else for that matter. I'll try to give you a little bit of information upon each of the questions that were asked. The first one is usefulness. Would you use this tool? As stated, is it useful to me, or in our case, a small company? You have to understand that Genocea is a small company that's based on a platform technology that identifies novel vaccine candidates, the common thread being that these vaccine candidates are all directed toward diseases where T-cell immunity is felt to be important. And that's an important characteristic of the company as to how useful this particular approach would be. Basically, small companies develop what they have. They may do this by either licensing in an asset, which may come from industry, or it may come from academia. So there's sort of a limited number of choices and a limited number of items that you'd be ranking. If it's an R&D-based company, as ours is, the criteria pretty much is what's available first and what is sufficient information to proceed with developing a particular candidate. There's very little selection that goes in as a result. So within the company, the utility of this kind of tool might be somewhat limited. It may be applicable to select a candidate to license in, or it may be applicable when you're first initiating the company to decide what disease states you're going to go after. But once you're up and going and a project is ongoing, the ability to use this tool, I think, is going to be somewhat limited. There may be some utility for prioritization, but it's more likely to be used by others in assessing our company and comparing the options that a particular organization may have for either funding or partnering or whatever. So it's unlikely to be used within our company, most likely to be applied outside. The major decisions that we use, the major items that we use in making our decisions are primarily feasibility, and is there sufficient criteria met for value that indicates a particular project could be commercialized or could attract external funding to promote the product's development. What about usability? The most relevant issues related to vaccine development, I think, have been covered adequately in the proposal. It's very comprehensive. That's not a problem. It also appears to be quite a flexible model, and I think there are some other attributes that other speakers have brought out that could be integrated into the model. Is it user-friendly? Yes, I think the interface looks good. It's uncluttered. It's broken down into sections that make sense and can be followed. The ease of understanding and demands on the user, however, can be a problem. For instance, in step 2, the population characteristics is somewhat daunting, and I think there'll be a steep learning curve for many people that attempt to use it, particularly from the perspective of a small company where we may not have the internal expertise to address some of the data needs. The questions that have been brought up earlier, and I'd just like to underline, is, first of all, where does the data come from? Is it up to date? How often might it change? This is important because the duration of a development program is quite long. It's measured in multiple years, more than a decade. And the underlying data that determines the population that has a big impact on the value of the project may change over that period of time. It looks like there's a lot of data to populate. So the question is there standardization or are there different sources of data that could be conflicting and lead to wildly different valuations of the project? For step 3, the question is disease burden and costs. One question that comes up is, would there be anything on the horizon during the development of the project that would dramatically change the value? New therapeutics, new approaches that would be either vaccines or not vaccines that could dramatically change the competitive landscape. I don't think that's adequately taken into account in this sort of a model, but it could be if you reiteratedly valued the particular project. I think that would need to be done. One example would be if a new way of prophylaxis came along with a drug or small molecule that might severely impact the utility of a vaccine for the same purpose. The issue of the data libraries, how should intensive needs for data input be addressed? Well, a key item, I think this is a key item. It looks quite daunting, and the question again would be how would different data sources affect the scoring of a particular vaccine? Also, I think other people have brought up, but I'd just like to underline that understanding the range of errors within the data or the range of values within a particular data set, and how that would impact the ultimate scoring of the vaccine, I think is extremely important. It would certainly help if everybody used the same data source, but if you have different people from different perspectives using this model to evaluate a particular product, they may want to use different data sources. They may be regional data sources for a population, international data sources, whatever, but it will dramatically change the value of the asset. So how should user groups think about data requirements and resources for data collection and standardization? I think this is a question that needs to be addressed. I don't believe that I'm the one to do that, or people from a small company necessarily, but I think it's something that needs to be considered. What about application development? How can smart vaccines be enhanced? One of the attributes that I don't think is covered is the likelihood of success. It is in one of the attributes, which is the likelihood that an asset would be developed or commercialized within 10 years or less or more. But the likelihood of success changes over the lifetime of a particular development program. Milestones are reached, new data comes out, more is understood about the characteristics of the vaccine. Somehow that has to be incorporated into the model. And another important point is, at what point is the likelihood of success changed? At what point do you get data that de-risks, what we would call de-risking the project, make it more likely to be successful, and therefore make it more attractive to potential funding sources, partnerships, or whatever? In vaccines, it's unlikely to be in phase 1 or early on in data. Sometimes it's a much later time point in the development process, but there could be surrogate markers that indicate a better chance of success. The last question was about outreach, how to engage other user groups. I think it would be interesting to get more input from those who are skilled in health outcomes, those that are involved in in-licensing processes that might want to use this tool to gauge the relative attractiveness of different vaccines. I think it would be very valuable to test approved vaccines, but use the data that was available at the time that the development was going on. What kind of score would they have reached? I think it would be very interesting to see, for instance, how would the varicella vaccine have been valued when it was first conceived, which is a long time ago, and then at the different stages in the maturity of that program, how did the value of that program and that asset change? I think that'd be very instructive. Some other items I'd just like to bring out. I think it's very interesting to see how changing inputs affect the value or the score of the particular vaccine under consideration. In the materials that we were given, there are a couple of tables where they've changed the duration of immunity, which is a huge question, particularly early on in the development of a vaccine, and the cost per dose, which also changes during the development of a vaccine because manufacturing processes will change right up until phase 3. But if you look at the changes in those two variables, you get a wildly different cost or price of qualities, a 7-fold difference from before and after. And I think these kinds of sensitivity analyses would be extremely useful. One concern I have is the limitations of the method need to be explicit. Would those organizations that would tend to fund early stage vaccines use this kind of a tool to pick the winners? And I don't think it's necessarily a valid or an intended use of this tool, but the appeal to rate a vaccine based on a single number that connotes a level of precision that's belied by the complexity of the process that gets you there may be irresistible for some. Finally, you should realize that many of the vaccine attributes are not known early on. The frequency of rare and serious adverse events, which could certainly terminate the development of a vaccine, are not going to be known until much later on, phase 3 or even after phase 3. Some of these adverse events might be expected based on the mechanism of the vaccine, but there are a number of idiosyncratic reactions that can occur, and they're unexpected based on either our limited knowledge of the mechanism or just some other activity that we just don't completely understand. And this is a problem, particularly for vaccines that are entering a novel space, where you're going into a mechanism that's not previously been tested. There are no precedents for the kinds of vaccine that you're developing. So I just want to end with one prediction, and I base this on the multitude of emails I get every day that are telling me what kinds of services a vendor could provide that will assure success of my project. I think that what it takes to use this tool will be beyond the personal expertise within a small company. So we will end up depending upon consultants or external experts to help us through this if we were to use it. As a consequence, I think this kind of tool could spawn an entire industry of experts in the valuation of vaccines, and I think there'll be a variable quality. But I can see the emails coming now where companies or consultants are guaranteeing that they can use the model in a way to improve our relative standing of our product in comparison to others. And I don't think that's intended, but it's somewhat along the lines of the consultants or the tutors you might use to improve your kids' SAT scores and improve their chances of getting into college. So I'd just like to end there. I think that there's a risk that this tool could be used to inflate the efficacy or minimize the risk of vaccines. I think the changes in some of these attributes that will occur over time, or the relative range of uncertainty with them, will be huge drivers of the ultimate valuation of any particular asset. And I just warn against boiling it all down into a single number, which looks pure and appears to have a level of precision that really isn't there. All right.
Great, thank you. And just because you're the 20th speaker, Ann, no pressure or anything, we do have novel comments up here. And the audience's eyes are mostly open now. For the first hour, it was a little borderline, so thank you, Ann.
So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the committee and NVPO for taking on this enormous challenge and for giving me an opportunity to make some comments on it. My perspective will be a little bit different because of the organization I come from, and I will add the disclaimer that the views I'm going to express are my own, but they're certainly informed by coming from Aeras, and so that everybody understands, Aeras is a not-for-profit biotechnology organization that's focused almost solely on the development of safe, effective, affordable vaccines to prevent tuberculosis. So coming from an organization that has already narrowed its focus down to one disease area, I think the usefulness of this particular tool is perhaps limited for us. We do compare multiple target product profiles, so different potential TB vaccines, obviously as an ongoing part of our portfolio management. But in order to do that, frankly, I think this tool is probably both more complex than we need, and yet in a sense not sophisticated or nuanced enough. So the disease model on which we evaluate different target product profiles or different potential TB vaccine candidates is quite a bit more detailed, more sophisticated than the disease model incorporated here in a number of ways. So it indeed takes into account interacting diseases, most particularly HIV, and even the rollout of antiretrovirals. It predicts what's going to happen to the TB epidemic over many years, because TB, unlike many of the acute infections that other vaccines protect against, the epidemic plays out over not just decades, but actually hundreds of years. And so to look at the impact of a vaccine, you have to look pretty far forward to really appreciate what one TB vaccine might do versus another. In addition, of course, TB is a very global disease. And so clearly having data from 2 countries, which I understand is just a beginning here, but our disease model needs to include data from about 190 countries. So I'll come back to that theme because I really do think, as many of the other speakers have said, that the issue of where the data are going to come from, how they're going to be validated, and then how they're going to be maintained over time is a huge issue for this project, and one that I hope we can come to some sort of innovative solution for. So I guess the other issue around usefulness is for us, since we're already focused on tuberculosis, when we're comparing across TB vaccines, the major issues beyond public health impact and affordability really come down to very detailed analysis of scientific and technical feasibility, both in the R&D process and in the manufacturing process specifically. And I think it's difficult for this model to capture that level of technical detail and analysis, as well as the business considerations. So often a decision in the end may come down to, do we have a good enough partner? Because we're a product development partnership. We do virtually everything in collaboration with someone or some organization, and those may be, early on they may be academics, but later they're biotechs and pharmaceutical companies, and of course we have to have funding partners as well. And so a lot of the decision about what vaccine is really going to move forward fastest may have to do with the strength of the partners, both technical and funding, that are available for a given project. In terms of the usability, I don't think I have a lot to say, having not actually used the model. I do think, from what I can tell from the screenshots, that the interface is extremely user-friendly, at least on the surface, at the superficial look I've had so far, and I certainly commend the developers for creating such an appealing interface. Again, I think in terms of usability, the data demands will come into play. So let's talk about that. I really do think, from my perspective at least, that that's probably the major issue that might limit the utility of this tool. I think we all appreciate that the quality of the data are absolutely key. And here, where you're comparing across diseases, you not only need high-quality data, but they need to be consistent and comparable across the different diseases from country to country. And while the quality of data from the US is very high, and actually from South Africa, relatively for a TB high-burden country, is extremely high, most of the countries where TB is the largest global health problem, the quality of the data are extremely variable. So how one is going to really fully measure the impact of a vaccine, unless an enormous amount of energy goes into providing high quality, consistent, and up-to-date data, I think is a real challenge. I do think the tool is extremely useful in terms of stimulating appropriate and useful conversations, and again, that may be its greatest use, is that it helps users focus on what they know and what they don't know, and what's really important to them as compared to potentially some other users and maybe even their funders. And so those are extremely useful conversations, and I think as a tool this can help generate some of those useful conversations. To me, that's probably more important than its actually ranking of vaccines. In terms of developing the application, I do think I was very pleased to hear that you're planning on expanding its capability to do sensitivity analyses, because again, I think that's absolutely crucial given the kinds of data and the uncertainties in the data that this model relies on. In addition, I hadn't been clear before today, but I think I'm clear now, that ultimately users will actually be able to weight the attributes and not just rank them. And again, I think that's very important, because obviously a simple ranking is a vast oversimplification of how people think about different candidates and what's important to them. Having country-specific data globally, certainly for a disease like tuberculosis, is going to be crucial. So that comes back to the data needs. And then the ability to enhance the actual disease models on which public health impact, for example, and costs and revenues are going to be calculated, I think is important if you really want to sort of get down to it with a number of these diseases. So the ability to predict how a disease or an epidemic is going to change over time, whether that's because of interactions with other infectious diseases, HIV, TB, with non-communicable diseases, so diabetes and TB, for example, or even just the fact that the population is aging in many countries, and certainly in the case of TB, that's going to impact the epidemiology. Same with increasing drug resistance. So there are lots of issues that a model needs to be flexible enough to address if it's really going to provide a good reflection, let's put it that way, of what is most likely to happen with a disease epidemic. So the last question was about outreach. I think it's going to be really important to identify what's the compelling argument for various users' use of this tool, so that you can focus on which users you're really trying to satisfy with this tool. I think we've heard today a range of opinions about its usefulness, and clearly, if you try to satisfy everybody with one tool, you probably don't end up satisfying anyone at all. So understanding what the compelling argument is for some groups to use it and then really focus on their needs is something I'd encourage you to think about. And then outreach, you know, I don't have the answer to that. It's not my expertise, but I would think a combination of really in-person demonstrations, letting people get their hands on this tool within those identified user groups, as well as web-based approaches, which are very prevalent and certainly effective in many arenas today, could be used for this as well. So overall, I certainly commend the flexibility of this tool and the complexity of the challenge you've taken on, and how well you've been able to begin to address that. I think from my perspective, if there could be, whether it's part of this initiative or a separate initiative, and Bruce talked about wanting this to be like a service to the broader public health community or vaccine community, similar to some of the contracts that NIH has to support basic and preclinical research. Perhaps the greatest service to the vaccine community would be to set up the data bank, the data source, to ensure the quality of the data as much as possible, to validate the data, and then to maintain it, which is going to be an enormous job over time. So whether that's an initiative NVPO or NIH or the Institute of Medicine or some other sponsor would take on, somebody's going to have to do that, because you're really going to limit your users if every user has to come up with their own data across disease areas. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. This was a diverse panel. 2 small company representatives present, 2 large company representatives via phone, and then various representatives from around the world. So it should be an interesting question and answer session. Before we go to questions, though, let me ask a process question of Guru. Are committee members allowed to ask questions?
I'm sorry, but there was one other person.
Oh, I'm sorry. So let's loop back to get, thank you for that, Anne. Ademola, are you there? No, okay. If you should come on, interrupt us and we'll allow you to speak. I don't know how you're supposed to hear that, but okay. Okay, so Guru, are committee members allowed to ask questions as well? Okay, excellent. So let's open the floor up to the audience first. Yes, please step to the microphone. And identify yourselves, please.
Thank you very much. I want to compliment this panel. You did an outstanding, thoughtful, thought-provoking job. I very much appreciate it. I'm not familiar with this tool at coming here and not having the time that you've had to work with it. But one of my concerns, and by the way, I'm Penny Hitchcock, formerly from NIAID, currently working with the Department of Homeland Security on early detection. So one of my concerns is the fact that in this particular country, we seem to be stymied by informed consent so that the individual agrees to be vaccinated, and as a nation, collectively, we seem to be losing our support for vaccine. Certainly, if you look at PAHO, the regional immunization program in other countries, they make us look like midgets compared to their vaccine acceptance and compliance program. So my question is, when you think about a vaccine, is it feasible? Is it an important disease? Is it cost effective? How do you figure in whether or not we can convince people to use it? Because we have many examples of good vaccines that are not used, and many examples of good vaccines where we don't have the policy in place to recommend use. Is this taken care of in the model, and how do you agree that this is an issue when we come to think about our vaccine priorities?
So process-wise, we'll have people who are present here on the stage answer the question first, and then we'll go to people who are on the phone. Okay, so I'm just going to pass the microphone down, and someone has to.
We'll keep passing this down.
Well, I'll take a rough crack at it. So the only way I can think of that issue, which is an extremely important one, of course, is captured in the models in terms of coverage rates. So you're building into what % of the population, your target population, is going to actually get vaccinated is one of the inputs into the model. Now, how that number gets estimated, the uncertainty around it, the sensitivity analyses are some of the issues we've talked about that would need to be done to adequately capture the uncertainty in that issue. I think that the need for a whole different initiative about education of the value of vaccines is a different topic.
Okay, so we'll go to phones now. Would any of you on the phone, Osman, Genevieve, or Diana, like to answer the question? No.
Genevieve, yeah. I think I reiterate the point that Anne just made, and what I also said in terms of trying to introduce several coverage rates as scenario analysis. At the minute, you can only enter one coverage rate and then compare two interventions. So what would be easier or more efficient in this situation is to introduce several coverage rates for the same intervention and compare the scenarios.
Good, thank you. Okay.
This is Diana. I'd like to add one other comment, which is that, you know, from the perspective of numerous stakeholders, you know, those activities that one might reasonably anticipate are needed to achieve a high coverage rate should be part of what people are considering as they prioritize vaccines in terms of not only the benefit you're trying to achieve, but what are the kinds of preparatory activities you need to take to achieve it. Certainly that's, you know, very true of the manufacturer side, evaluating what sorts of education and awareness materials and campaigns, et cetera, are necessary. It's also what I was referring to when I asked for the central organizing process around the tool to engage public health community around what steps they will take to fully support a high priority vaccine being introduced. And I think the question is an important one, and it should be something that different stakeholders do speak to in terms of their willingness to get to the optimal level of coverage and how they envision doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
It's Osman Mansoor from University. May I comment?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Oh, please comment, yes. Osman, go ahead and make your comment.
I think the issue of acceptability, I think, is also particularly important for the health workers as well in terms of the presentation. I think we have experience of presentations of vaccines which are challenging to use, and that also creates a problem, as well as obviously the clear issue of demand from communities. In relation to community demand, I think we have the experience when a vaccine is available that for a disease of high visibility, for example, meningitis in the meningitis belt, the demand for it is obviously huge. I think when it's for vaccines which don't have the same public perception, I think the issues are very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That received a lot of commentary. That's good. So how about one more question from our audience? All right, we're going to go to my questions then. Okay. Let's go to pilot testing and field testing. And this isn't just Joachim. I'd like to hear from more than Joachim on this. How might you imagine this could be done, both with regard to who we engage, where they live, who they are, how we engage them, or how we shouldn't engage them, perhaps, is important as well. Going to pass the microphone again across the panel.
Let me just ask you for some clarification on the question. Pilot testing as in a user pilot testing it. I made a couple of suggestions in my talk there at the end that I think that people with expertise in health outcomes would be very valuable. They should, I'm assuming that they are familiar with the kinds of data sets that go into this kind of evaluation, and they also may have a greater appreciation for where the variability lies. They can be found in academic institutions, but there's also a large segment of them within the pharma business that where this is what they do on a daily basis. And I think it's a little bit different from at least what I'm familiar with how they've operated in the past. So they would provide not just a reasonable level of expertise right out of the gate in order to be able to use the tool, but they'd be able to compare it to other methods by which they have evaluated health outcomes in the past. And that kind of a contrast, I think, would be very useful.
So I think that's a great point. And I would just add, I can imagine sort of two types or two purposes for the pilot testing. One is to help make it technically robust, so you get the real experts who understand these kinds of tools to use it and provide a review. But then I think you also want whoever you think your key users are going to be, who may not be as educated about these sorts of tools, to actually use it and share with you their experiences of it. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say on my side, it seems to me that you, in going to the field, and I think this is about going to the field rather than trying to get the field to come to you, that you focus on not so much on the IT aspect of the tool, the kind of cool toy part of it that excites us all who are, we spend a lot of time dealing with the technology, but focus on the methodology and the development of the tool, focus on the attributes themselves, sort of remove yourself from the fancy, glitzy part of it and focus on the core and the substance of it.
Yeah, I mean, not very much to add to this, just to give an example, and I'm not suggesting here that you can now jump on the plane and go there and immediately kind of test your tool, but we discussed over lunch the specific case of an African country that basically needs to consider whether to introduce meningococcal vaccine or rotavirus vaccine. And here you have actually a situation where you have two vaccines with very different characteristics, where different type of considerations and attributes actually may play in the decision making. Such a scenario where you could really kind of test the tool as a decision aid tool, also to understand whether you actually are gathering the necessary data, what is actually a process of selecting or rating attributes, I think would be extremely helpful. So I think if such a thing can be arranged, I think this is probably of great utility for the development and really testing of such a tool. And I agree with what Alex said. I think it's now really time to move away from the theoretical development of the tool, but really looking at, how would it perform in at least in one or two specific settings.
And I would certainly agree with that last comment, but I think we need to be very defined about what we mean by pilot testing or why we're doing the pilot testing. If it's there for the validation of the model as far as it's been developed right now, that's one type of design for a pilot testing. I mean, there I think you'd want to go to basically go back to a decision that relates to maybe priority rating of particular vaccines, being sure you choose one in which you have a very high degree of confidence that you made the right decision. Otherwise, it could be rather embarrassing for a number of other reasons. But I mean, that's the robust background to the testing. The other is to see just how well that model works in bringing maybe disparate cultures together to achieve a priority rating. In other words, you're presenting an unknown in which you want to achieve a decision. Maybe, if I may add one more comment, from the discussions that have been going on that I've listened to today, at least in my mind, the model has been sort of very holistic and been interpreted in fitting every purpose without maybe dissecting what that purpose might be. I think the model and the attributes on which one would focus would differ very much whether or not you're choosing the model to establish a priority listing of vaccines for development, whether or not you're establishing a priority list of vaccines, either for different diseases or multiple vaccines for a single disease, for acquisition purposes, where you're going to put your money, in other words. And, you know, maybe even using the model as a method of negotiating for a particular acquisition decision. So you do that transparently.
Great, thank you. Now we'll go to the phone. So Genevieve, would you like to comment?
Hi, yes, thank you. I agree that there are several levels to validation and to user interaction that we should go down. And you know, this brings me to a very recent situation where the Apple Maps would have been useful if they had sent it to some users to validate, and they might have avoided the unhappiness that then resulted once the iOS 6 was downloaded onto all of the phones and Apple Pads around the world. So, you know, having a great deal of eyes and different stakeholders and users reviewing it are only going to ensure that whatever comes out in the end is packaged and delivered at the highest level of excellence. And we know that, I mean, I am a modeler myself, and there are two types of errors that generally happen in modeling exercises, and there's a structural model error that happens and doesn't involve parameterization, which is then your second type of modeling error. And then obviously there could be calculation and human intervention as a third type of error. But so having flexibility of, you know, distributing the code, allowing the code to be evaluated, manipulated, and tested, and then allowing the parameterization of the tool to be also once again tested. And as I also suggested, that might be a good way of introducing some type of validation is in terms of using previously published interventions, using the exact same methodologies, data, and identifying if the tool delivers the same exact results. I also suggested in my talk about a type of platform, almost like a Wikipedia type platform, where you know, collection of information as well as comments and data could be managed in that way, allowing for the fluid updating of the tool. Those are my suggestions.
Thank you. Diana? If you don't want to comment, it's okay. I'm just respecting you at a distance.
No comment, thank you.
Right, and Osman? Okay.
No comment from me.
Sorry, what did you say? No, okay, thank you. All right. Would anyone in the audience like to comment? No. Okay. I'd like to go to data. There's a lot of discussion of data and how critical the data is. We applied lots of adjectives. It's got to be maintained. It's got to be, what we haven't said explicitly is it has to be housed, right? Someone needs to take responsibility for this. It has to, it's so dependent on the data I don't want to ask a particular question. I wonder if anyone here would like to go a little further than they did in their presentations and speak of data and perhaps say something that is a thought or a suggestion back to, not just a comment on the model and how important the data is, but a suggestion to the committee about thoughts they may consider, just because data is so important. Be creative.
There are discussions underway among some of the senior partners, in some cases at senior levels, around the data challenge. I think there is a developing desire to really start tackling that problem in a more concerted way. Not that it's been ignored, it's just that it's being recognized as the time has come to really try to do something very serious about it. I would suggest that perhaps the committee that is working on this stay in close touch with UNICEF, WHO, others that are very directly involved in that as that discussion unfolds. It's not just a problem of maintaining the data, it's just getting data and recognizing not only within countries, but not only from country to country, but within countries, it is so sparse, the availability, the timeliness, the quality of it. We're all being challenged by it. This isn't just a vaccines issue. This is across all. So I think it's a very serious question. You've got this great tool with a lot of different attributes and weighting that you've made very flexible, but it all relies on, there's an assumption within that you're going to have the inputs to make that all produce what you want. But that's going to be a challenge when you get to the point.
If I may add, I agree with this. I mean, this morning, I think it was Carter Dix who said most of the data you need are data you would be gathering through surveillance activities. I think that's probably true, but we also know that this is not going to happen that easily. Even though I think it's a good again to underline the importance of surveillance. I think apart really from efforts to gather really more primary data, in the end of the day, we will have to rely on estimations. That's where we are in, that is the reality. And most of the data we have today are being developed. The problem, and I'm really not a specialist in this area, is when methods, how to estimate those change. And this is something that is actually happening quite frequently, and where we have different camps and different perspectives on how this ought to be done. And this is, of course, something that in particular, if you take a long-term perspective, which is quite problematic. So an element of consensus building around these type of estimations would be really greatly needed, but this is a major challenge. That's the only thing I can say.
You know, while we all recognize that good, reliable, consistent, quality controlled data is essential to support the validity of a decision, I don't think that, since we're not there, is where we'd like to be, that doesn't necessarily mean that this particular model approach is an inadequate approach and we can't move forward without having all the databases in place, validated, and so forth. I mean, in itself, running with the smart vaccines model actually allows us to identify those weak points in our data sets that can be strengthened. So I don't think it's necessarily negative.
I agree, and I mean the other thing is, of course, that I mean in many cases we need to exert good judgment. We need to gather the necessary expert opinion. Also, these type of approaches can be kind of a bit more systematized. So I think, I mean, I agree that even we are not living in a perfect world where we have all this data. So we need to find ways around this, and I think it can be done.
I like that. This should not be an obstacle. Great. Okay, we'll go to the phone now. Genevieve?
You can still hear me, can you?
Yes.
Good. Well, thinking creatively, as you suggested, I think a lot of the items have been raised in terms of the lack of it, but maybe what we could achieve is once we get the sensitivity within the data, that will then give us some parameter of confidence about the results. And then you would have your cost effectiveness claims and maybe your acceptability curves that could give you, in terms of utilities, and that will give you some understanding of do you reach your objective with the maximum amount of iterations. Saying that as well, we'd have to identify what the minimum amount of iterations you'd have to run the model with to identify what sensitivity you were happy with. Outside of that, what we could do, similar to a grading system, is let's say it was an estimate, you'd give it the lowest grade. If it was published randomized control data, you'd give it another grade, and you could come out with an aggregate grading of your data, and that would give you how much confidence you would have in the outcomes. And as better data did come to the front, or more reliable sources, if it was a decision and guidance was provided by the committee to say you should choose your population data from this website, you should choose your demographic data or your epidemiology data from these websites, or your and if you deviated from that, the grading would be something else. And then that way you could come up with a overall scoring, trying to keep away from scoring, but an overall scoring of how you perceive that evidence and your confidence in the evidence based solely on the data, not on the preferences or any of the other assumptions.
Great, thank you. Diana, would you like to comment?
Just only the brief comment that I think the major utility served by this kind of common data function will be transparency and enhanced dialogue. It will probably not serve to, eliminate all of the different discussion that goes on about which data set is most relevant, the highest quality, et cetera. But it will serve a transparency function and contribute to the overall quality of dialogue. So I think there's probably a level to which the debate around data to be used in the tool should probably not go, because it may just reflect differences of opinion that could rightly exist around data sets, coming from different sources and having slightly different implications on the overall decision process. And it should just come out in discussion rather than trying to be fully resolved in a in a storage and archiving tool. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative and close the session after Osman has the last word. No word?
I think the issues of data are very complex, but I don't want to.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. A long panel, a detailed panel. You put your hearts into it in addition to your mind. Thank you very much, everyone, and those of you on the phone as well, and audience. Thank you very much.